Hey, Etta, can you see the handout? Can't hear you.
Can we keep it up there, but
Yeah,
also
I'm gonna
some
leave it
people?
there. I'm gonna leave
But-
it there.
And can people then put faces over it if they want to, or no?
Yeah, they can arrange the screen anyway. It depends what the device they're on, but yeah.
Right, okay. Because I want to be able to see, well, actually, you know what? I'm gonna do it so I can see faces. Wait, I'm gonna try to do it so I can see faces. Here we go, more.
Just go.
I can't see any faces, Martin. What am I doing wrong? I'm on my iPad.
I don't know. You gotta should be able to see everybody. I mean, I can see you, and I can see me, and I can see Gail.
Oh, let's see.
Maybe you have to hit view.
Yeah, I don't think I have something that's called view on my iPad.
Really? It's got to be there somewhere.
No, it's not on the iPad. It's, I mean, my computer is set up to do that, but the iPad loses some functions.
You
I
don't
can
see anything that says side-by-side gallery?
No.
Oh, boy.
There's Aaron.
I'm gonna go put this on my computer. I'll be right back since nobody's here yet.
Okay.
Hi, Aaron. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, I'm unmuted now. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah. How are you?
Okay, how are you?
Good. What's new?
Nothing much.
Well, did you get it? Did you get vaccinated?
Yep.
Good. I think probably all of us did.
Yeah, I think most of us have, yes.
Yeah.
We're doing our best.
Pretty soon.
Who's here?
You and Etta and Gail and Ed and me so far.
Usual suspects.
Yeah.
Do you see, what device are you on, Aaron? Are you on a PC?
No. Why?
Oh, yeah, because Etta was on the iPad and she could not see everybody.
Yeah, I don't know. It must be something about her. There's Ed. I see Etta. Etta came.
Well, that's because I'm still on the iPad, but I'm moving it over to my computer.
Okay.
Yeah, I have it on my PC. I mean, it's 20 some odd inches and I can see a lot more.
Are you falling over to the side? Edward?
Yeah, yeah.
You're like my
Yeah.
grandson. I hold him, and he's still. You fall over.
Do you have me there twice now?
No,
Okay. You don't have me twice?
I don't think so.
Martin, did you disconnect me? Because I'm leaving the iPad and, oh, I know why. Okay.
can I say that one editor is more than enough?
Yeah.
It's like Jello.
Yeah. It's been 3 weeks, I guess, since we had our second shot, and Gloria's gone to the eye doctor. Both of us went to the dentist, And on, I guess it was Wednesday, we went to Trader Joe's. It was the first time we had shopped since, I guess, February of last year. We spent $100 on junk. It was like two children, in a candy store. Oh,
You
this
would've-
kind of chocolate.
You would have spent close to that even if you've been going there. They have it set up for you to do that.
No. Normally we're a lot better. We went in and we got, blueberries that we wanted, and Gloria wanted carrots, but I saw, the chocolate, then I saw potato chips, and she saw popcorn, and cheese, and it just went on and on. It was wonderful.
This,
We got onion soup that we had never tried. I mean, it was just two kids in a candy store.
now when was this, Ed? Was this yesterday?
No. It was Wednesday. Wednesday or
Listen.
Thursday.
Can we have, not have the sheet up all the time? Because then we can't see each other. It makes it harder to discuss, I think. I mean, we could deal with one question at a time or something, or does nobody else have the sheet printed out?
I have the sheet printed out. I'll read it
Okay.
if people want.
I have it on my iPad and I have a sheet printed out.
Okay, so. does
Let's take
anybody
it down, Martin. I guess we need Martin to come back to take it down. Does he put it up?
I will unshare it. It's fine. No problem.
Well, just like,
Hi,
Uh,
Debbie.
all right. Hi, everybody. Okay.
Was
Okay, now
anybody at
she-
services this morning?
I was.
Yeah, I was too.
Yeah.
Thought the kid did a really good job.
Oh, he's
Yeah.
cute. He's adorable.
Lisa,
Yeah.
you're on mute.
I just unmuted, thank you.
Okay. And Sue's on mute.
Lisa,
Sue's on the other
muting,
side.
Lisa,
Yes,
muting is not your normal way of behavior.
that's true. It's very unusual.
Well, we'll give it another minute, I guess, because it's 1:01.
Right. Sue likes to be heard but not seen.
Well, she's neither right now.
I will be seen at the appropriate moment.
Whoa.
Ooh, that was very,
Whoa.
I am,
Oh,
I'm looking forward to the revelation.
yeah. I
don't
am
hold your
anticipating.
breath.
There's Sue. Whoa, here we have
There
Sue.
she is.
Da-da-da-da-da.
Okay, Etta, why don't we go? I will let people in as needed.
Thank you. Okay, so let's start. Just in general, did you like the book?
Yeah.
Not
Raise your
sure.
hand if you like it.
50-50.
Okay,
Yeah.
50.
you like
I'm
the second
50-50.
half, right? Okay, why is the book called Like Dreamers?
Comes from the Psalms.
From the Psalm
When we-
126.
When we return to Zion, we're going to be like dreamers.
And most appropriately, because this was the return to Zion
Right.
of the soldiers. Oh, I just wanted to get that out there. And I love the subtitle, which I didn't realize until I went through this time. The story of the Israeli paratroopers who united Jerusalem and divided a nation.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
I mean, that's exactly who they are. But as I think we've started to see, who they are changed as much as and as exemplary as everything else. So I wanted to open up with just a discussion of who were we in 1967 around when the war started, or prior to the reunification of Jerusalem. What did we know about, care about? Has anybody in this group been to Israel prior to 67? Prior to 67, Martin?
Wait a minute. Yes. No.
1965.
Okay. Did we
What were you
see each
doing
other
there?
then?
What were
I
you
don't
doing
remember
there, Martin?
bumping into you.
What were you doing in 65, Martin?
I was on a month-long program.
I was on a year-long program, and the visuals of Jerusalem that I had from that period in my mind was very much the barbed wire between where we were and the rest of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Okay, so a couple of us. Who was the other hand that was raised prior to 65?
Peter.
Peter, what were you doing? Peter, we can't hear you. Or I
Can't hear
can't.
you.
Something's wrong. No.
Hello?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, I was on a program called Summer in Kibbutz, and it must have been about 62. And I do remember, there was no going into the old city. And I do remember that as we passed Egypt, everybody, the guards with us pulled out their guns. I remember that we were kind of in the north, in the Upper Galilee, and we're kind of worried about whether we could be shelled by the Syrians.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That didn't stop with 67.
If anything, it became more so. But just to get a sense of what was your personal relationship to Israel at the time? Didn't know, didn't care, no, cared. Go ahead, Gail. Why don't you start?
I grew up in a Zionist home. My grandparents were ardent Zionists. And actually in 1967, I was supposed to go for 8 weeks to Ramah in Israel, Camp Ramah in Israel. And it was going to be very exciting. We didn't know at the time that things would, become dangerous. And in May, of course, it appeared that, Israel would be attacked. And my parents decided that I would not be going there. But I returned to one of the Ramah camps that summer. And I just remember we were all so proud. We had this very utopian vision of Israel. We sang Yerushalayim Shel Zahav all summer long. That's all we talked about all summer was Israel.
Right, that was post-war.
That was right after the war. It was, the same month. It was at the end of June of 67. And thinking back now, I wish I had the opportunity to go that summer because it would have been one of the most amazing summers.
Okay, what I want to do is, if you don't mind, limit this discussion to at the time before the war broke out, because I think American Jewry changed a tremendous amount at the time of the war. And for those of us who didn't have we hadn't already been in Israel, I think the war was slightly different than for those of us who had been. Suzanne, you had raised your hand?
Yeah, I had, but I'm going to end with something
Okay.
that was the day the war started. I had never been to Israel. I actually was no longer in religious school. And Israel was sort of back there, but it was something, I knew proud of and pro of, and most people, non-Jews as well, a lot of them had the same feelings. When the war broke out, I had been in the World's Fair in Montreal, and one thing I remember is that there was an apartment, what has become an apartment building, that was part of the fair that was designed by an Israeli architect.
Moshe
Safdie.
Safdie.
Yeah, right. And that had been pushed an awful lot.
Okay. Anybody else?
Well, I can tell you what my parents' reaction was right after the war.
No, I want to get to that in a
Okay.
second. I still want to just make sure. Physically, where were you when the war broke out?
I was in Johannesburg.
America.
I was in Johannesburg.
Okay, so everybody was pretty much at home or
No,
close to home.
Well, I was in Canada, but
Aaron?
I moved to Montreal in February 1967. I had been drafted. I refused to go. And I left the United States and moved to Canada. So 67 was a very different setting for me.
And I think it's important to remember that the backdrop to the war was not only Israel's existence, but also Vietnam here.
Yeah.
Aaron, did
And-
I pass you on the street?
I'm sorry, Suzanne?
That's all right. I was thinking since I was there for a few days, said to Aaron, maybe I passed you on the street.
Oh, right. Okay. When the war broke out
I'm
now.
sorry, I'm having a lot of trouble hearing different people. Is that at my end?
Probably.
Or other people?
Yes.
Okay.
Gail, what I had to do was I switched to using earphones because the speakers on my computer basically gave up. So that might, especially if you can't hear lots of people.
That's why I'm using
Yeah.
earphones.
Heads on.
Okay. And then the day the war broke out, or the couple days before, couple days after, did anybody have a gut response to this war? I mean, we kind of knew it was building up, but I will start. I remember a very good friend of mine who had never been to Israel. She was a Hungarian immigrant, though she wasn't acting like an immigrant anymore. We were now in college, and not that immigrants act anyway. But she called me in absolute panic. What can we do? Is Israel going to be destroyed? So I'm curious about that kind of response from people.
I'm having a bit of a disconnect with what Americans may have felt. In South Africa, it was very clear. Two things happened. Number one, there were blood drives at every synagogue in Johannesburg.
Interesting.
That's number one. So everybody gave blood because it was going to get to Israel and they're going to need it. But the other one was that just before the war, Aria Pincus, the head of the Jewish Agency, issued this request that young people from the diaspora come to man the kibbutzim because everybody would be at the front and that they would need somebody to come in and do the work in the fields, in the cattle, in the dairy farms and so on. So we had thousands of people volunteer to go. Now, what actually happened was, so we all applied, we all filled out the forms. And for us, it was June, so that's the middle of the academic year.
Perfect time to go.
So anybody who went lost a year of university by doing that. Because we didn't have semesters, we had a year. So if you went, you lost a year. That was it.
And how many, Martin, how many South African university Jewish students went, do you think?
Hundreds and hundreds. The only reason I didn't go is I was only 17 at the time. And in order to go, if you were under 18, you had to get your parents' signature on the piece of paper. And my mother happened to be overseas visiting her brother in London, and I couldn't get both signatures. Otherwise,
You
I
mean
would
your
have
father
gone.
said yes?
Well, my father cried and said yes, but he didn't make any difference. My mother wasn't there to sign, so I couldn't go. But all my friends went, every single one of them.
And they went because they saw an existential threat and they could help?
No, the cry went out from Aria Pincus saying, "You need to come and help us. We need you now." So they got on planes and went. Now they got on the plane. It was already.
It was over.
It was a week after the war. The war was over by the time they got there. So what happened to them, in fact, I'll just end with this, is because at that point there was no need for them to be on the kibbutzim anymore because the war was over. They all went on the Machon Madrechei Chutz La'aretz year course instead, and joined the North American.
And many matches were made.
And many matches were made during that year between South Africans.
And it was good.
It was actually many marriages were made.
Yes.
Okay, other people, did you see around you or sense do you remember an appeal coming from Israel to come? I don't remember that. Does anybody else? Luisa?
Yeah, I was like Martin in my last year of high school in Argentina, including my Jewish secondary school, which I was attending, and I was getting ready to go for the whole of 1968 to the Mahon Greenberg, which was the Mahon so you were at the Mahon Le Madrichim, Martin?
Yes.
Well,
Can I ask I'm
So
sorry,
I
can I
remember,
ask what that is?
excuse me?
Can I ask what that is? I'm not familiar with that.
Those were institutions that were supported by the Israeli Ministry of Education in conjunction with a Jewish agency to improve Jewish education throughout the world. And the Mahon Lemadrichim was, if please correct me, Martin, there, because I'm not so familiar with the Mahon Lemadrichim, but I know many, many people from Argentina who went. It was usually the people from the youth movements, from the Zionist youth
Makes
movement,
sense, yeah.
who would
Makes
go to
sense.
Israel to spend a year so that they would really receive a specialized training to come back and continue training the people in the youth movements. And in my case, it was the Mahon for teachers, for people who had been studying Hebrew, Jewish Judaic studies for many, many years. And it was a similar purpose to have us there for a year of proficiency and then go back to our home countries to teach Hebrew and Jewish education. I read a book about that not too long ago, and it was exactly based on the concept of improving Jewish education overall in the diaspora.
Okay, we have one more minute on this topic. So does anybody else want to share the impact of the war breaking out on them or their families or their friends? Sue Resnick.
I was in confirmation class at the time. We were preparing for confirmation, and we had a huge discussion about whether or not we should suspend it, and that all the confirmation students should go to Israel and work on the kibbutz.
Okay, so kibbutz, I think something that's come out is that kibbutz was a very big thing to replace the guys who were going off to the war. Okay, moving right along, because I think I'm supposed to do that and I usually can't. I hope most of us have read a good chunk of what was assigned for this week. What did you notice about how the soldiers felt about the impending war, Debbie?
I just wanted to say something about my parents, that they wanted to give a victory party after, when it was okay, when everybody, and her university department, which was quite Jewish, people thought that was in poor taste and didn't want to come because, we should understand both sides, blah, blah, blah. Okay, Jewish people.
Understood.
And
That's
I remember them being very stung about the attitude.
Interesting. Okay, so what did you get from the book about what was the ideology that the guys who were going into the war and in the war, what did they come with? What was their, and I'm saying ideology very specifically because I don't think that's a word that we use so much today. But at the time, it was very important in Israel, particularly. Any comments from what you read?
Well, there were competing ideologies. I mean, you had the religious ideology, and I learned a lot about Rabbi Kook. I haven't finished, by the way, everything. And then, of course, the kibbutzniks, and even I didn't realize that I was aware of the communal ideal, but I didn't realize that for many of them it was Stalinist.
Yeah, same here.
Well, the kibbutz movement there were three of them, right? There was the religious kibbutz movement, the large one called the United Kibbutz Movement, which was sort of the moderate center. And then there was Hashomer Tzair, which was also quite small, but was very, very socialist. Now, the people in the book are from that movement.
Yeah.
The very socialist left-wing part of the kibbutz movement.
And I can tell you as an example of that my parents had friends whom my father met because he was a GI. These were people who were in a DP camp after World War II and made their way to Israel. And the woman had a very bad back. She was in a lot of pain. And they were on a Shomer Tzair kibbutz in Israel. And she wanted to get a better bed because everybody had,
Standard
terrible.
issue.
And she was told, no, the kibbutz, everybody, well, not until everybody can afford it, not until the kibbutz as a whole purchases it, but no special treatment.
Hmm.
That was the communist ideal there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the impact, when you think about it, and I didn't realize the statistic, I think only 4% of the population were on kibbutzim. If anybody remembers that that's wrong, tell me. But the impact in the army was huge. So most of the leadership came out of the kibbutzim. I think but Hashomer got a lot more noise because I think, one, they were more extreme, and two, some of them still had a very close relationship with the Soviet Union. At least they believed that they did. But I also want to mention the kibbutz Hati, who were modern Orthodox. They were what later became called the Kippah Sruga, the Knit Kippah group, who were not super from. I mean, they were super from, okay? They were observant of all rules, but they were also accepting of other Jews, like Rabbi Cook was accepting of other Jews. But I think the ideologies, what struck me also was how much the ideology of the kibbutzniks, how strong it was. It replaced religion to some extent, that
It was a religion.
Yeah, go ahead, Ed.
It basically was a religion. If you talk to any of them, they talked about it as if it was a religion.
And they believed they were bringing a better world.
Yes.
Yeah.
And not so different from the Orthodox Jews, the vehicle perhaps slightly different, though the Orthodox Jews accepted that they required the secular Jews to make it happen. And then it was going to be according to halakha.
The other thing that strikes me as important for context with regard, because you're all Americans and I was in South Africa, and I think the atmosphere there was vastly different in terms of the response and what the community had to do and all that kind of stuff. There was nobody in South Africa who said, "What are you celebrating here? We want you want a war." But at that time, the United States was not that good of a friend of Israel. If you think about leading up to that, there was the War of Independence, and there was the Sinai campaign, which Israel and the British and the French went into Sinai, and it was the United States that stopped them and said, "Go back."
Right.
It was John Foster Dulles, I think, who did that. And the lightning strike on the air forces of Egypt and so forth. The planes that were used at that time were French fighter jets, not American.
Yeah.
There was a whole different world in terms of that. We were aligned with the French and Russia, not so much the United States. Israel was not aligned with.
And if you remember, the Israelis attacked the USS Liberty, the spy ship. I was working for the Navy at the time, and that was a big deal because of, all the sensitive equipment that was on it. And again, the US was not so pro-Israel per se at the time. So that was, I was looking at it from a different point of view, from where I worked and what I saw. I was Jewish, and I was, happy about one thing, and I was also, working for the Navy and saying, "Hey, why are they shooting up our ship?" So, there was certain mixed emotions there.
Ed, I don't remember, or at least I didn't remember until you just said it, the attack on the USS Liberty.
Yeah.
Can you, when did it take place? What month? And can you fill us in a little bit about it?
Well, it's kind of vague, but what I remember, it was during the attack during the 7 days of the war.
June 8th, 1967.
Okay, yeah,
June
it was
8th.
in June. It was during the war. And the US was spying on both the Israelis and the Egyptians. It was, the ship was an intelligence gathering ship.
It
And
says here it was an accident.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm
I
sure
guess
it's
that's a cover story.
yeah, that's a cover story.
If it's Wikipedia, it has to be.
No,
Lisa?
the
Oh, I'm sorry.
whole part was the U.S. was gathering intelligence on what was going on. If you remember, the Egyptians had Russian equipment, and we were in the midst of the start of the Vietnam War, and it was really important for us to find as much signal intelligence on on Russian equipment as it was on the French equipment. By the way, a sideline on that, very interesting, is the Israelis captured some Russian MiGs from the Egyptians, and all of a sudden we became very good friends with the Israelis, because the Israelis turned over 2 of them, I believe, to the U.S. government, and flew them to Nevada, their test flights.
Okay, I think that's a good additional piece of information in terms of background to the war. Just to kind of summarize where we are until now, the American community, less than the rest of the world Jewish community, was impacted, but less than the rest of the world community. But many American Jews wanted to go, picked up and went. But it wasn't as pervasive, I don't think, through our smaller communities in which we lived. And America had a very special interest in this, in part because of the Vietnam War and the ability to gain intelligence about the Russians, and because that's what our countries do. Any other comments, or anybody want to correct that? And if not, we're going to move on. What did you pick up from the story about the religious, not religious, but ideological religious differences from either the Orthodox and the kibbutz guys, or anything else? How did they get along? I mean, how did they play together?
Amazingly well, right?
I'm sorry, who said that? Was that you, Aaron?
No, that was Al, but
Al, speak, Al.
No, I got the impression that they got along very well. It was surprising. I would not have thought so.
okay. Now that's what the impression that you get.
God, Aaron, we lost you. You froze up, Aaron.
I don't think that Yossi. Okay, I'm sorry. Better?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
How fast?
That's the impression that Yossi gives you in the book, but I'm not sure how real that was. Look, Yossi is coming from a perspective himself. He's a religious Jew, very, very frum. He was very frum at one time. And his impression about religious Zionism, that was a minority. The religious Zionists were a separate bloc. They weren't that powerful. They weren't that important until after '67 war. But Yossi gives them, and I don't say that Yossi is wrong.
Okay, Aaron.
After
we lost you again, Aaron.
Prior to '67, the religious Zionists were not as big a player as Yossi gives them in the book. They were much more important afterwards.
Martin?
Okay, so Aaron, you're saying basically he's cherry picking?
I agree with Aaron on that. I mean, in South Africa, B'nai Akiva existed. B'nai Akiva was minuscule. Beitar and Habonim were way larger, way larger. So I think that, Yossi's perspective is somewhat affected by the fact that he himself came from a religious point of view and sought out religious people. The one thing that struck me in the book that indicated this was the attitude towards kashrut, where a lot of these Hashomers, Hatzair, and other and secular Israelis were flouted kashrut big time. There's the story about them shooting a rabbit and cooking it.
But I also think that he gives the context of that I think is important is this was a time in Israel in general where lots of people were coming in with lots of different cultural backgrounds. And people recognized that somehow out of all of that, they needed to create a society. I mean, he talks
An
about it
Ashkenazi
when,
one.
No, it was very
yes,
simple.
except they also talk about there's the one guy who gets assigned to work with the new Olim, and he's like, what do I want to do this for? I mean, you're right. It was an Ashkenazi perspective to bring people in. But I think at that time in Israel, there were so many different cultural backgrounds that everybody had to learn to get along at some point in the army. I mean, it's why the army was so powerful as a cultural unifier at the time.
Suzanne?
I'm going to speak with my experience as a growing up in a suburban conservative synagogue, not particularly observant, although somewhat, never kept kosher, attended the religious school at the synagogue. And I think our perception of Israel up until this time was the proverbial land of milk and honey, because that's what we heard. And this was our place, and this is where these wonderful things were starting to come from. I don't know how serious, I don't think most Americans, certainly from what I came from, were particularly serious about Israel. Now, afterwards, many of them became serious in one way or another. But at the time I'm thinking of, it wasn't a really major part of our lives.
I think that's correct, Suzanne. I just want to add to that the reform movement did not have programs in Israel yet.
Right, they didn't like, yeah.
But they started them almost immediately after the war, and they became the largest purveyor of Israel programs in the United States, at least.
Yeah, the one thing I want to call your attention to pages 152 and 153. I think this is really important because what Yossi sets up here is he sets up, particularly in drawing Rabbi Moshe Levinger, who is a very pivotal character after the war in '67. He's the guy who basically spearheaded the movement to settle Hebron, to put a Jewish community back in Hebron. And what Yossi writes in here is very interesting. He puts it into Arik's, Achmon's character. He said, despite himself, Arik was fascinated by this unexpected outbreak of defiant pioneering emerging from religious Zionists of all communities. And see, that adds weight to what I said. I don't think the religious movement did not play a very critical or even an expected role. I mean, you can find going back to Rabbi Cook, you can find that strain.
Okay, I would just disagree with you, Arik, because
strain.
One, they had the religious parties took part in the government. They were needed for the coalition then as much as they are now. So they had huge influence. Now, the fact that there were a very large group of Orthodox Jews that would have nothing to do with the state and during 48 carried out the flag saying, no, we don't want the state. That changed to some extent. Martin?
I think it was a big shift, though. I think that first of all, they were small. And secondly, nobody paid much attention to them. Their participation in the coalition was only about education and the question of Jewish identity, marriage, divorce, and that kind of stuff. That's all. they paid no attention at all to foreign affairs. To me, the eye-opener in the book is the fact that what we see today, where you have this overwhelming number of people supporting settlement and unification of Jerusalem and Jewish rights to Judea and Samaria and all that stuff, was not something we talked about before 67. And even in B'nai Akiva in South Africa, I mean, the emotional part of it was, well, the wall and the question of Gush Etzion, right? I mean, this is a place that the Jews had been thrown out of and killed during the War of Independence. And this was sense was, at least we need to go back to that and reestablish that kibbutz. But apart from that, there was not much attention paid to. I mean, in South Africa, you had Habonim and you had Beitar, which were the revisionists, were very, very big, but B'nai Akiva was tiny.
You know, it was, but my year course, I was with Young Judeans 65, 66 in Israel. And I would say 30% of us who were not Orthodox went to Kibbutz Dati. We had a choice of which kibbutz we would go to. Not, you know, not a total choice, but you could say, I want to go to a religious kibbutz. And a lot of people went to explore religious Judaism and to see it on the kibbutz. So I think the influence was a possibility. And I mean, coming out of that year course of 56 kids, I think we have 4 or 5 who became Dati because of that experience.
My guess is that's a big difference between the America and South Africa. In South Africa, you have a community that was 99% Zionist.
Right.
Not the
And
case
mostly
here.
secular Zionists, right?
Right.
Ben Gurion and so on, not the religious Zionist type. So,
Debbie.
Well, you got to remember that Beitar, non-religiously, thought it would be pretty cool to have, you know, what's now called the territories, Judea and Samaria, for secular reasons or historical reasons.
They weren't in charge.
And what I loved about the stuff, starting with Rav Kook, was how this is the beginning, this is the seed of what turned into a gigantic thing, the religious settlers. There were religious Zionists who had religious kibbutzim, perfectly happy to stay within the 48 boundaries. There were Beitarniks who definitely wanted to expand the state of Israel, not for religious reasons. This brought it all together.
Right.
And it has exploded since then. And that's was one of the most fascinating things to me about the book.
Right.
Louisa, you were going to say, or you are going to say?
I wanted to follow up on what Martin was saying about the difference in the American society and the Jews from the rest of the world, because the Jews of the American society are particularly inclined towards the religious aspect of Judaism, because the United States has a big stake on that Protestant ethic. But what is true of communities throughout the world, and particularly if you think of the origins of Zionism, and if you think of Ben Gurion and people like Ben Gurion, it was actually, Zionism was always secular, and it was almost opposite to the religious aspect of Judaism. So the concept of religious Zionism is very young, as opposed to the whole concept of Zionism, which by definition is secular. And I'm going to add that in my experience in Argentina, for example, there were many schools that were supported by Habonim, actually, the wing of Mapai in Israel, which was Zionist and secular and cultural. And it reflected the fact that Argentina, being a Catholic, part of the Catholic world, it was not particularly inclined to go to church. It is a society that is not a religious society. So it's important to have that perspective, because America is very unique in the emphasis on religion when you compare America with the rest of the world.
That's really, really interesting, Louisa. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think we are, I am ignorant of a lot of that. Okay, I think it's time to move on to the actual guys. Oh, go ahead. Well, I'm sorry, Sandra.
Yeah, I'm sorry we were late. We were doing something, but you know, I think two things that really astounded me about it is, you know, I think that, you know, it was really, I mean, it was really that because of the 67 war, that religious Zionism could actually have more than the kibbutz, because they were the kind of modern Zionist religious, you know, people, not the old school of, but I think also the idea that, you know, that they were exposed to each other in the army, you know, and they had to get along, like you said. And so it was an acculturation thing for many people. I mean, we see as the story develops about each of these people that, each of these men that, you know, it was, you know, they really did have, you know, some respect for each other. And I think that was also really important because when I lived there in 73 war, you know, there wasn't a lot of respect for people who were, you know, going to be completely different and go into the West Bank and do these things that they didn't, you know, other people didn't approve of. You know, I don't think anybody foresaw through that by trying to unite and respect as a team together, that they would make these lifelong, you know, very, very complex relationships. And that's what I liked about it, because I was part of a youth movement, and there were other people that were on the other end of the youth movement, but it was, you know, really important to, as Israel developed, and also the idea of, you know, how people developed into a capitalist society. And I think Lou and I were talking earlier that maybe when people were, you know, unequal immigrants, it was very difficult. But the idea that at least on a kibbutz that everybody is taken care of, you know, from each according to his ability, each according to his needs or her needs, I think was a pretty successful way to form this country. And I like the fact that Yossi Klein was on the religious insight end of that too.
Okay. All right. I think it's time to move into looking at these guys and where they were coming from, because in the other two parts of the book, we're going to find out who they became, which every time I read it, it blows me away. But starting out with who they were, I listed their names because I thought it might be easier for us, because I found that most of them who had adopted Israeli names began with A and B. They wanted to be at the head of the class. And that, I mean, boy, it's hard to keep them straight. So
Yes.
They're listed there. I would just open it up to which character did you identify with any of them? Or did you find you could be the most sympathetic to, the least sympathetic to, you didn't like, you liked? I'm opening it up to whoever has any thoughts about these guys. And pretend they're book characters and not real people. Oh, there's Sue Resnick with a hand in the dark, in the air.
I think less about who I liked from this is that I have an appreciation for something that we did not see in the American press, definitely, is that how long it took to attain Jerusalem and how bloody and horrible and primitive the whole battle was.
Can we also speak to the fact that when they get to the wall, it doesn't look like it looks today? And I only became aware of that a few years ago. But it was very narrow, there were houses. I mean, it had been like, well, it's there, but it hadn't been an important element. And I also have another question, and this may be for later on. Was the kibbutz movement at this time, was it beginning to decline? What did the impact did the war have on the decline?
I wouldn't say the kibbutz.
Aaron, we have to do something about your speaker.
I wouldn't say the kibbutz movement was declining at all in 67.
But
No,
when
I
did
would-
it start to
Based
decline?
on my association with the youth movement, Habonim, we still had Garinim, as we called them, who were groups of people who were going to settle on a kibbutz together. And that continued well into the 70s, 75,
Yeah.
70, well in itself. The kibbutz decline that we have now witnessed, where the kibbutz, the buildings exist and the name exists, but the kibbutz as a structure does not exist anymore, as a communal structure does not exist anymore, is 80s and 90s, not at this time.
Yeah.
So that when I was in Israel in the 73 visiting my sister, I don't think we got to go to any, but the kibbutz movement was still relatively strong.
Right, they weren't in the hotel business yet.
Oh,
That's why you didn't go with your
I,
sister.
I stayed in, no, I stayed either at the dorm with her or all sorts of different places. So it was a real low budget trip.
Even in the book, we see the beginning of the decline of the kibbutz movement. We have one of the characters who knows he's no kibbutznik, and we also see in the another character who can't quite get into the full Stalinist ideology that elders have. So we're seeing the beginnings of the decline of the kibbutz movement in some of our characters.
Yeah, but we're seeing that in the Hashomer Sa'ir part of the kibbutz movement, in the Ichud HaKvutzot VaKibbutzim, the general kibbutz movement, which had hundreds of kibbutzim, not just tens. You know, the question of whether the kids would live in the children's house or move back in with their parents and they build larger apartments for parents so that the kids could live with them was not that big of a deal for them because they were not nearly as ideological. Whereas the Hashomer, that was like breaking the whole idea that the kids didn't belong to particular parents, they belonged to the community at large. Much more extreme. I think what's important to me about this book, frankly, is that if you read this book immediately after 67, you say, why is he emphasizing these religious guys? Yeah, they have these messianic kind of visions of themselves. In the hindsight of history, knowing what happened to all of this, which is what we're going to read next, how dominant that thinking became, this messianic view of Zionism and attachment to the land and the temple and all the rest of it, was not really the case. What I remember from immediately after the war were clear declarations on the part of Mapai that ran the government, was that other than Jerusalem itself and Gush Etzion, because that was really ours, but we'd been overrun, we were going to give, we put a couple of settlements down the Jordan River Valley to protect the rest of Israel. We were going to give this back quick. This is all going back soon.
Yeah. Yeah, the character, for example, the character that I related to, sorry.
So go ahead, you might as well continue.
The character that I related to, Yoel Ben Nun, I don't think I would have related to him anywhere as much before Yossi's book.
Why, Aaron?
Because recently, I guess my politics has moved further, much further to the right, where I see that,
Aaron, talk towards your speaker, because we couldn't hear that last sentence.
No, I didn't say anything. I'm trying to think of how to phrase it. It seems to me that religiously, if you're going to give back any of the land, why one part and not another part? What makes one part sacred, one part not sacred? Maybe I become a maximalist, but giving back any of the land has increasingly become more abhorrent to me and more useless to me and more of a waste of time as an argument to me. I become a maximalist. I don't give any of it back.
Yeah, but the parts you're talking about are all the historic parts. We gave back Sinai, we gave back Gaza. There's some argument about the Golan Heights, but the parts you're talking about are in the Torah. So, right, unless you're going to say that we shouldn't be in Tel Aviv either.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Louisa, do we just hear you moving or are you actually about to speak?
No, I was just moving around.
That's okay. You're
Yeah,
allowed to.
I wanted to say something. You know, they touched upon it in the second part. The other thing about, you know, Israel at that time was absorbing lots and lots of people from Sephardic backgrounds, right? From all over. And they weren't, you know, born into or ideologically from Russian, you know, socialist, communist, you know, heritages, right? And so it really changed also a lot of society around that time. Again, the armed services being kind of a melting pot, but, you know, they did touch on it, but it's really important to remember that, you know, the army for people also who were new immigrants and felt like they were the underclass, treated as the underclass by the Ashkenazim that were there, you know, earlier. They really had their own kind of difficulty with, you know, not defending the country. I think they were mostly, you know, very loyal and very, you know, turned out to be wonderful leaders, but I don't think they had the you know, kibbutz ideology at all. There's some Sephardic kibbutzim, but I don't think they had that socialist, you know, communist kind of ideology. And so they had a whole nother path of what they thought was going to be their fortune or their good life in Israel. And I think he didn't talk about that enough. I mean, in the second part, he talks a little bit more, but I mean, that's a big factor of what happened in Israeli society.
But he's only talking about the soldiers who were involved in Jerusalem.
Yeah, but he does talk about how some of them were shocked that, you know, that you know, he talks about relationships outside of just that group, and you know, and how in Haifa and other places there were starting to be protests, and there were starting to be, you know, these things like, we don't want to be stuck in the middle of nowhere. We didn't come to Israel to be, you know, a farmer, right? If I'm from Tehran and educated or whatever, right?
Right. Okay. Fair point. Anybody else? All right. I want to mention the one thing that it struck me about them, about the war from the American perspective. None of them, at least of the ones that he's written about, had a problem going to fight to protect Israel. We were sitting here with some of us in Canada, some of us willing to go to Israel to fight to protect Israel, but not willing to go to Vietnam for whatever reason. We were there and it wasn't clear, which is why we weren't willing to go, perhaps. But none of them had a problem with the concept of war to protect their home. Even the most resistant to fighting in the war, who I think was Udi Adiv, well, Udi Adiv actually did think that the war was something that was created by the generals. He was a little bit of a Trumpian in his thinking, but it was it Meir? Yeah, it was Meir Ariel who felt like, if I have to die to protect my family and my kibbutz and my country, I'll do it. But overall, he was overwhelmed by the concept of death. That was the society in which also, I think, existential existence, which is what existential means, the existence of Israel was very much threatened, and they felt it because this was already the third war in many of their lifetimes.
Yeah.
Well, there was this overwhelming sense like, is this going to be another Holocaust, right? If Israel is overrun, it will be the second Holocaust in essentially 20 years. Right?
Yeah.
And so that, I think that's what overwhelmed, and that's what turned the American Jewish community around, if I understand it, is the recognition that this really was an existential threat against the Jewish people worldwide, that Israel should be overrun. So I think that was, but I think the reason Yoshi's book is interesting and important is that he happens to be writing about the people, or at least some of the people, who ultimately created the dilemmas and the conflicts that are in Israel today, that we're arguing about today.
Yes,
If this religious group had been happy to pray at the Western Wall and had no aspirations for Judea and Samaria and had no territorial aspirations and just said, all we want to do is lay tefillin,
exactly.
then this would not be an important book.
Right. Yes, good
It's
point.
because they became a very powerful force in Israeli life and Israeli politics that this book
So.
becomes.
Yeah,
Couldn't
that's a
have
good
known that
point,
in
Marty.
67, though.
I'm sorry, Martin, repeat that, and then
You couldn't
Aaron.
have known that in 67, that there'd be this religious awakening and these aspirations from these messianic dreams that people started having, that all of the land of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. That wasn't on everybody's lips at that time. It
Well,
became part of it.
except that those students who were at the Merkaz heard Tzvi Yehuda, the young Rabbi Cook, a month and a half before the war saying, my country is divided. How can I have this? That shocked me as much as anything, was that he was, I'm going to say prophetically, he was foretelling that something was about to change, and he at least had the aspiration for that to happen without any knowledge that that's what they would be fighting a war about. And it certainly wasn't what they were fighting about to begin with. They were fighting for existence.
That was one of the things that I needed to research, but there seems to me there was a real shift between the father, Rav Kook, and the son, Rav Kook, because the father, Rav Kook, was the rabbi that even secular Jews in Israel, in Palestine, respected as representing a kind of a view of the religious world that they could at least relate to. And it seems that Tzvi Yehuda Kook, the son, is quite a bit different ideologically than his father.
Yeah, Marty, I think you're correct in that. And that difference, I think, is that the younger Cook saw.
Aaron, we missed what they saw. Finish that sentence again.
You got to get another computer, Aaron.
That the younger Tzvi, as
Yeah.
Sorry.
victory over.
All right, Aaron, this is going to be a problem. Next time, what you'll do is
Redemption.
call in next time, and we'll hear you talk, and we'll see your face. Okay, because this is hard. Okay, any other thoughts?
I maybe this is a little revisionist, but what I saw developing is an arrogance, because this messianic fervor, this, God is with us, and that went into the society and led, if you read about the 73 war, you see how Israel's society had contempt for the Arabs. They didn't prepare. The 67 war gave them such a sense of, I would say, superiority, that God was with him from the religious point and from the secular point that the Arabs can't fight, that they were completely unprepared in 73 for what happened. And they were nearly overrun because of that. So, you depending on your time frame, this book goes from 67 to, hey, here is what's happening from this point of view. But there's another point of view of really what happened, that there was another very serious threat to Israel in 73, and they were not prepared for it.
Well, I think we're going to see that in some of the reasons that it was so prevalent, that they weren't prepared.
I just want to share that in 67, I was at camp. I was a counselor now at a Young Judea camp. And we had speakers, and most of the kids were generally speaking from non-observant homes, though there were several that were from observant homes. But generally speaking, you know, with some kind of at least attachment to Israel and Jewish education. Our speakers would come, and these were people who, some of you will know the names, like Joe Wernick and others, and talk about God entering back into Jewish history. And when we would sing in Birkat HaMazon, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, the beginning flowers of our redemption, for me as a almost not teenager anymore, that was very real. And so that even though I didn't look at it as necessarily, it was maybe God was really in history and helped make it happen. So that arrogance might have been founded to some extent, certainly on the part of the orthodoxy, that was very much a part of what was going on. And here we were. I was very much of a secular Jew and always probably would have been. But I just wanted to throw that in. Okay. Yes, Luisa.
I personally, as I said, I arrived in 68, and I saw the elation as military, as opposed to any other angle to look at it. And I cannot but think, when I think back, to think of the perspective of that particular war coming out of the ashes of the Holocaust, and the fact that a lot of people had actually abandoned the religious aspect of Judaism during and after and because of the Holocaust. So to me, it was an astonishing path for that generation that participated, because that was the generation that were the children of those who had survived the Holocaust. So I think it's rather, if there was probably a sense of astonishment at the military prowess, particularly looking back at what had just happened in the 40s. And I think that is probably a lot of what fed a lot of the thinking of that particular generation coming out of it.
Peter?
I'm kind of reminded of, you know, that it's almost like the Holocaust was the crucifixion, and the reestablishment of Israel, and then, you know, Jerusalem as the resurrection.
That's a beautiful analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sandra?
Just a little bit after 67, you know, and I lived there during the 73 war. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because somebody mentioned about, you know, the idea that we were surviving after the Holocaust. And one of my professors was interested, we didn't know the name of it then, but we didn't really have a name, but we went and interviewed people whose parents were survivors, and from all different walks of life. And we began to diagnose, I guess, PTSD, as we call it now, in the second generation. We were interested in how the second generation was going to, you know, view themselves in relationship to their parents' trauma. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because clearly some of them became, you know, not only after the 67 war, we see that, you know, it was a very, unlike most of us Americans, as we've said, we didn't know how many people were seriously injured, both mentally and physically. So it was a time of recuperation. And a lot of people had, you know, a lot of the reason I'm bringing up now is because a lot of the soldiers, and not just the soldiers, but even their parents, it brought back a lot of, you know, the existential threats of existence, and whether we as a nation in Israel could really survive with hope. So 67 was a big boost, but when 73 came, it was a different story.
Yep.
And I also led a group part of the time at Hadassah Hospital of, well, we'll talk about it next time, in the 73 war. A lot of young men in tanks, the few that were there on Yom Kippur, burned up, and they didn't have any remains. And, you know, in Jewish law, you have to have some remains. I had a dental friend here that did dental forensics on some of them that you could find, but they couldn't find most body parts. So later, there was a group of young widows from the war. And here we see that they're also going to some of these young widows and trying to comfort them and their families. But it was a generation that, you know, didn't expect that to happen in 67 or in 73, to lose so many young people.
Okay, it is 2:03, and I think we're supposed to go until 2. Am I correct there?
Mm-hmm.
So we're just about done. I just want to, I think I want to end on an additional note, which is somebody started this conversation with, we spent, I think Gail, it was you, we spent the summer singing Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. And they pointed out in the book, and I had forgotten, I knew Naomi Shemer wrote it. I didn't realize she wrote it before the war. And it was a very, the lyrics, just a couple of lines of it were very different, having to do with their separation from the wall rather than in its heart there is a wall. And the response to it from, I guess it was Udi Adiv. No, that it wasn't Udi Adiv, I'm
Mayor?
sorry.
Mayor
It was
Ariel.
Mayor Ariel.
Yerushalayim Shel Barzel.
And that was, I remember when that song came out, and I was surprised it didn't have a little more reception. It was received and it was good, and he became sort of the unknown Bob Dylan of Israel. But that response to war, as opposed to a united Jerusalem, I think is in the makings for what's going forward. So
But
imagine.
added a verse, Edda. She didn't change the word. She added a verse.
Oh, is that correct? Oh, I didn't understand.
Yeah.
Okay, can anybody, if anybody can find me and send it to me separately, the words to the original, Debbie's got it. I know, she has Dr. Google with her.
Rav
Okay.
Google.
Rav Google, right. In this case, Rav Google. Or
He comes Dr. Google probably in the next hour.
Reb
It's
Google.
open.
We are glad to hear that. I'm kidding. Let us adjourn this discussion and plan for the next one. I'm turning this back to Sue, I guess.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. This was a great conversation, a great start to an interesting book. For April, and our meeting is on, hold on a moment, April 10th. We're going to just be reading part 3, Atonement, because it's about
Yom Kippur.
about 150 odd pages or so. Anybody who would like to volunteer to lead that one, you can either volunteer now or let me know. Oh, Debbie Kagan has stepped up, and so we're going to do that. Just a reminder that through a week, 2 weeks from yesterday, I'm taking nominations for our next books, so that we can send out a link, a survey rather, for that. And next week, Sarah Norris will be doing, starting her talks about the Cairo Geniza. So that's our adult ed that starts next Saturday. And I don't have anything else. Does anybody else? Don't forget to turn ahead your clocks tonight. That's it. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you. Great class. Great class.
Terrific.
Learned a great deal that I didn't know, and that's always helpful.
Sue.
Because people in this group can always do that.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, I've got to
Shabbat
go.
Shalom.
Bye, David.
Same.
Yeah, I started reading it.